Today we have a crazy revenge story about a lying neighbor. We'll get into that in a bit, but first, cheat on your wife with mine? I will burn your life to the ground. My first marriage happened when I was quite young. I was barely 24 years old and my wife was 22. We had found love just right after our first degree in the university, and it seemed like the perfect timing to settle down and think about family. I'm now 30 years old. My name is Mike, and my ex-wife Emily should still be facing the consequences of cheating on me. This is a story of how I got some much-needed revenge. Things moved on as fast as they could. We had 2 kids, and regular mornings as they grew up were me having a coffee in hand, worrying if their fighting over who got the bigger slice of toast was just sibling banter or if it would grow into something more. Soon, I had other worries because Emily suddenly became distant. The clues were piling up, and no matter how much I tried to ignore them, they demanded my attention. Emily's phone seemed permanently glued to her hand, her eyes darting across the screen before quickly locking it the second I walked into the room. Family dinners became awkwardly silent as she smiled at something, or someone, on her phone, leaving the rest of us out. One day, curiosity led me to check the odometer on her car after one of her visits to her mom. Nearly 200 extra miles had been added, a huge red flag. Then my daughter dropped the bomb casually. We didn't see Grandma this time. My stomach turned. If she wasn't at her mom's, where was she? As much as I wanted to believe this was all in my head, the truth was knocking, and I couldn't keep ignoring it. The doubt became unbearable. Emily and I had built a life together, a home, a family. I didn't want to accept that she was capable of tearing it apart, but the signs were there, and I couldn't leave things to chance. Not when my kids were involved. They deserved a father who knew the truth, not one who buried his head in the sand. One evening, after Emily went upstairs to shower, I noticed her laptop sitting on the counter. I don't know what possessed me, but I couldn't stop myself. My hands trembled as I opened it, my heart racing as I realized I might find answers I wasn't ready for. Then I saw it, a sticky note on her desk with her email and password written on it. My conscience screamed at me to stop, but my fingers moved on their own. Typing in her login felt like crossing a line, but I had to know. When her inbox loaded, it didn't take long for my worst fears to be confirmed. There they were, emails from someone named Bob. Explicit, disgusting, and full of mockery about our lives. She called our marriage dull as if the family we built together meant nothing. My hands shook as I scrolled through message after message, each one hitting me like a punch to the gut. Emily wasn't just distant, she had completely betrayed me. The next day, I reached out to Ron, a private investigator my friend had recommended. The emails were bad enough, but I needed more, something concrete, something undeniable. I laid everything out for Ron, the emails, the mileage, the strange excuses, and the way she had changed. He listened carefully and assured me he'd find what I needed. A week later, Ron delivered. He handed me a folder packed with evidence, photos of Emily meeting Bob at a hotel, records of their rendezvous, and even shared expenses that proved just how deep this affair ran. As I flipped through the photos and notes, my anger grew, not just at Emily, but at Bob too. This man wasn't just some fling. He was married, with kids of his own, living a double life. Ron's investigation revealed even more about Bob. He wasn't just anyone. He was a married VP at a company owned by his father-in-law. The hypocrisy was unbearable. Here he was, flaunting his affair with my wife, while his own family lived under the weight of his lies. Worse, I learned that he had been emotionally manipulating his wife, Linda, using threats of financial ruin and custody battles to keep her silent. I couldn't stand by and let this continue. I reached out to Linda, unsure of how she'd react. We met at a small cafe, away from prying eyes. As I laid out the folder of evidence, her face turned pale, and tears welled up in her eyes. I knew something wasn't right, she said, her voice shaking, but I never imagined. Linda revealed more than I expected. Bob wasn't just cheating, he was controlling, abusive, and using their kids as leverage. He had threatened her, saying that if she ever exposed him, he'd make sure she lost custody. By the time we finished talking, we had made a pact. Together, we would take down Emily and Bob, exposing them for what they truly were. Linda offered to dig up more dirt on Bob, while I focused on organizing the evidence and making sure it was rock solid. The plan was meticulous, each step designed to cut deep and leave no room for rebuttal. Step 1 was about making a statement. Emily had insisted on a family barbecue, a chance to play the devoted wife and mother in front of everyone. But I had other plans. Divorce papers would be served right there in the middle of her act, exposing her betrayal for all to see. Step 2 involved Bob. Linda had unearthed a goldmine of dirt on him, including financial misconduct at his father-in-law's company, where he worked as a VP. With her assurance that his father-in-law wouldn't tolerate scandal, we prepared a damning package of evidence for him. Step 3 was the final blow, tipping off the media. Linda's sleuthing revealed more than just infidelity. Bob had been cooking the books. A few well-placed calls to investigative journalists ensured that Bob's name would soon be synonymous with disgrace. Linda and I left nothing to chance, double-checking every detail like soldiers planning a mission. Though fueled by anger, we approached our actions with precision. Late at night, doubts crept in. Was this too much? Was I crossing a line? But then I thought about my kids and the way Emily mocked our family. This wasn't just revenge, it was justice, and justice was worth fighting for. The day of the barbecue arrived, sunny and cheerful, masking the storm about to hit. Emily was in her element, laughing and mingling, acting like the perfect hostess. My heart pounded as the server approached, dressed sharply, an envelope in hand. "Emily," he said, his voice professional but loud enough to draw attention, "you've been served." The scene froze. Emily's laughter died as she fumbled with the papers, her face a mix of confusion and panic. "What is this?" she sputtered, her eyes darting from the document to me. I stayed calm, though every muscle in my body tensed. "It's exactly what it looks like. We're done, Emily." Gasps rippled through the crowd, whispers spreading like wildfire. Emily tried to regain control, stammering excuses. "This is a misunderstanding. You're overreacting." But no one seemed convinced. Her carefully curated image was crumbling before her eyes. The very next morning, Linda sent the evidence to Bob's father-in-law. By midday, Bob was called into the office, his world starting to unravel. The photos of him sneaking into hotels with Emily were damning enough, but the financial misconduct Linda uncovered sealed his fate. By the end of the day, Bob was fired. His accounts were frozen as investigators combed through his finances. Linda wasted no time filing for divorce, armed with proof of his infidelity and manipulation. She moved out with her kids, leaving Bob to face the mess alone. Word spread fast. Bob's perfect image shattered, and soon he was evicted from his home. Former friends distanced themselves, and whispers of his disgrace reached every corner of his social circle. The media picked up on the financial scandal, ensuring his humiliation was public and lasting. Emily didn't escape unscathed. As news of her affair broke, her reputation crumbled. Family and friends began to distance themselves, unwilling to be associated with her betrayal. She tried to play the victim, but the overwhelming evidence left no room for sympathy. Isolated and exposed, she faced the consequences of her actions alone. One quiet night, sifting through old emails, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. In a series of messages to a close friend, Emily confessed that her affair wasn't just about passion. It was some twisted sort of payback. Years ago, I had unknowingly dismissed something she deeply cared about, a disagreement I had barely remembered. But to Emily, it was weighty, and her resentment had grown, twisting into a grudge. Her words revealed the truth. She'd used our marriage as a battlefield, our family as collateral damage. Realizing this wasn't just infidelity, but a deliberate act of malice hardened my resolve. Emily's bitterness had poisoned everything we'd built, and I couldn't allow her to continue manipulating our children or me. If I had been determined before, I was unstoppable. Emily and Bob's betrayal had wrecked the life I once knew, but it had also given me clarity. Justice had been served, and with it came the chance to rebuild. My kids deserved better than the lies Emily had woven around them, and I was ready to ensure they got it. I refined every aspect of my plan to ensure Emily couldn't escape accountability. Every document was airtight, every piece of evidence prepared not just to expose her lies, but to protect my children from further harm. They deserved better than the web of manipulation she and Bob had spun. If she wanted to play dirty, I was ready to ensure she paid for it. Emily's next move was predictable, and just as vile as I had anticipated. During her visits with the kids, she and Bob began planting seeds of doubt. "Your dad's just angry," they'd say. "He's trying to ruin our lives because he's bitter." They painted me as a vengeful, spiteful man who couldn't handle losing. The lies took their toll. My eldest daughter came home one day with tears in her eyes. "Dad," she whispered, "Mom says you're lying about everything." It felt like a punch to the gut, but I refused to let my anger show. Instead, I knelt down, met her gaze, and promised her the truth. "You're old enough to know this. I would never lie to you." That night, I gathered all 3 kids around me. I didn't overwhelm them with the worst details. Some truths were too heavy for young hearts. But I spoke honestly and from the heart. "I've made mistakes," I admitted, "but everything I've done has been to protect you." I showed them carefully chosen pieces of evidence, Photos, messages, and documents that made the truth undeniable. My youngest clung to my arm while my eldest sat silently, her eyes glued to the proof. "You don't have to take sides," I told them, "but you need to know the truth, and that I'll always be here for you." The relief that swept over me when my daughter said, "We believe you, Dad," was indescribable. Their trust, their love, that was the real victory. No matter how much Emily twisted the narrative, she couldn't manipulate their hearts. With the children standing firmly on my side, Emily's carefully curated world began to collapse. Friends who once supported her distanced themselves as the truth of her actions came to light. The whispers around her grew louder. Even her own family, once her staunch defenders, seemed unsure how to justify what she had done. Her public persona, polished and perfect, cracked under the weight of exposure. Unable to bear the judgment, she moved out of town, leaving behind the home we had built together. She tried to start fresh, but her reputation followed her. The betrayal, the lies, she couldn't outrun them. Bob's downfall was equally thorough and in many ways poetic. His firing from his father-in-law's company was just the beginning. The divorce Linda filed was swift and brutal, stripping him of assets and leaving him with nothing. His spotless image as a successful businessman was replaced with one of scandal and deceit. He tried to find work, but his reputation preceded him. By the time I last heard about him, he was picking up odd jobs just to scrape by. The friends who had once flanked him at parties vanished, unwilling to associate with his tarnished name. Even his children, disgusted by his actions, refused contact. With Emily and Bob out of the picture, my focus turned entirely to my kids. They became my purpose, my reason to keep going. Together, we began to rebuild, not just our lives, but the trust and stability that had been shattered. I made our home a sanctuary of love and safety. Each day, I showed them through actions that they were my priority. Slowly, I saw their smiles return. Laughter began to echo through the house again, and the weight of betrayal lifted. The journey wasn't easy. There were nights when I lay awake, replaying every choice I had made. But as I watched my children grow into strong, kind, and resilient individuals, I knew it was worth every struggle. Looking back now, I realized that I didn't just survive Emily's betrayal, I grew stronger because of it. My family's love and trust remained unshakable, and that was a victory Emily could never take from me. Also, hi, my name is Brendan, and if you guys enjoy these pro-revenge videos, it would be awesome if you left a like or left a review if you're listening to our podcast. That said, our next story is Lies That Hurt. I met my husband D when I thought I was genuinely done with love. I was tired of giving my heart to the people who wouldn't appreciate it or take me seriously. My previous relationship before D ranked high on my list of relationships that should never have happened. The mere thought of my ex gave me PTSD, so I decided to be by myself for as long as I could, and trust me, to avoid any string that could lead me to the path of love. But when I met D, he convinced me to give love and trust another try. He was different. Although he carried this weight of silence around him, I still find him quite attractive. Whatever he carried was so deep that I was immediately intrigued by his plight. Despite his aura, he was thoughtful and sometimes annoyingly quiet. Being a talker, I found it very hard to relate with him easily at first, because he would keep quiet even when I expected him to loosen up and give his take on the issues at hand. However, with some time, through our long talks and shared moments, I began to see the depths of his soul. He began to share how he had been through some tough times, both in his career and personal life, and as a result, he became a guarded man. It took him a while to open up to me, but when he did, he gave me his all, or so I thought. And after 4 months of knowing him, I said a resounding yes when he asked me to be his girlfriend. Our relationship began like many do, with excitement and hope. You know, that usual adrenaline that engulfs new lovebirds. I felt all of that and more. We were there for each other through thick and thin. It was just so easy for me to show up for him. I don't want to say it was out of pity, but something about him showed sadness and pain. I think I will attribute this to his ill health. I remember how he was in and out of the hospital on different occasions. I was there for him during his bouts of ill health when we were courting. His health challenges were sometimes overwhelming, and they required patience, understanding, and a lot of love. I stood by his side as much as I could, and I lost count of the numerous hospital appointments that I graced with my presence. Each time, I would hold his hands during treatments and provide the emotional support he desperately needed. Fast forward to years later, he asked me to be his wife, and we exchanged our vows months later on the most decorated altar I've ever seen. It was a lavish wedding, and we were surrounded by friends, family, and well-wishers. I had my dream wedding, to be honest. Life felt right, and I was convinced that Dee was my soulmate and the best companion I could have ever chosen. Every morning, I would make him coffee and we would sit by the window, sharing small, happy moments. My husband was a hopeless romantic, and he did lots of little and big stuff that showed how much of a dedicated partner he was. I genuinely believed we would weather any storm. In the beginning, married life was everything I hoped for. We were in sync, our lives intertwined in the most beautiful and purest form of love and partnership. We shared everything, our thoughts, our dreams, and our fears. I felt insecure in the knowledge that we had faced adversity together and come out stronger. I mean, we've been through it all, from health to healing, and all the in-betweens that life threw at us generously. But my happiness and comfort didn't last as much as I thought they would. It was so short-lived that I quickly forgot what it meant to once have it. It started with subtle changes in him. The attentive, affectionate man I married began to seem distant and preoccupied. He would come home later, spend more time at work, and seemed more distracted even when he was with me. Conversations that had once flowed easily became difficult and were often cut short by his restlessness or excuses of exhaustion. At first, I blamed it on the pressures of work and the everyday stresses of life, but as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the distance between us grew more pronounced. I couldn't keep quiet anymore, so I had to voice my concerns. He'd dismiss them, laughing gently and brushing off my worries. "Just overthinking," he'd say, kissing my forehead. His reassurances calmed me, and I tried to believe that it was just a phase, that maybe he was stressed from work or grappling with something he couldn't yet share. I tried to give him space, reminding myself that relationships sometimes go through rough patches. But the unease lingered, and it was obvious that D was no longer the man I courted and married. I found myself second-guessing everything, from his laughter that seemed forced to the way he avoided my gaze during quiet moments. I read meaning into everything he did, and I paid attention to his behaviors because I was desperate for a cue. I just wanted to see the signs that something was amiss. It was around this time that I noticed his interactions with our housekeeper, Miss A. She had been with us for several months, a quiet and efficient presence in our home. Initially, I thought nothing of their relationship. After all, it was normal for him to be polite and friendly to someone who was part of our household. But I was compelled to pay more attention to the interaction between our housekeeper and my husband, D. And soon enough, I started noticing interactions between them that left me uneasy. When I started paying attention, I noticed that there were moments that felt wrong. Lingering glances, conversations that would abruptly end when I entered the room, and laughter that seemed too intimate. I became scared, and my heart began to ache with a suspicion I didn't want to acknowledge. I kept telling myself that I was being paranoid, that perhaps I was simply overanalyzing every little detail. I tried so hard to brush off every suspicious thought that kept lingering in my heart. Unfortunately, the feeling persisted, gnawing at me until I couldn't ignore it any longer. So, one evening, after D came home particularly late and avoided my questions with vague answers, I decided to confront him directly. I told him about the unease that had settled in my heart, and about how I felt as though he was slipping away from me. As usual, he listened in silence, his face blank and expressionless. He waited for me to finish, after which he simply shook his head, dismissing my concerns. "You're overthinking again," he just said. "A's just a bookkeeper. She means nothing more than that." After that conversation with D, I thought I was indeed letting my imagination run wild, so I pushed my concerns aside and tried to trust his reassurances. But every day as things grew worse between us, his words that were meant to reassure me had the opposite effect. I felt as though he was deliberately downplaying something, hiding a truth that I wasn't ready to face. The twist was how I tried to believe him, to push aside my doubts and focus on salvaging our marriage. So I intensified my effort towards devoting myself to creating a warm and loving environment, hoping that if I poured enough love into our home, he would come back to me, heart and soul. One day I broke down in tears. All the while, I had thought that D was the perfect man for me, and thankfully he didn't hold back on loving me and showing me that he was a good man. In that moment of pain, I couldn't stop wondering why he had become a stranger to me in a very short time. I knew I had been played, but I needed to find out to what extent. Since my husband wouldn't own up to me regarding his relationship with our housekeeper, I decided to take some measures to find out what was truly going on. I hired a team of technicians to install hidden cameras around the house. It felt like a drastic step, and I battled with guilt as I watched them work. But my heart and instincts screamed for answers, and I was no longer willing to ignore them. The cameras were discreetly placed, one in the living room, another in the kitchen, and the most crucial one in our bedroom. It felt invasive, even wrong, to spy on the man I had once trusted with my entire being, but I needed clarity. For the first few days, nothing unusual happened. Dee maintained his routine of coming home late, barely saying much, and retreating to bed early. I watched the recordings, each time with a pounding heart, but there was nothing to confirm my fears, so I began to think that maybe I was overthinking. Until one Thursday evening. I had stayed late at work to meet a deadline. When I got home, the house was unusually quiet. Dee claimed he had an urgent business dinner to attend, so I thought little of his absence. After a shower and dinner, I sat down to review the camera footage, as I had grown accustomed to doing, and what I saw shattered me. I left my mouth agape for a long time. The camera in our bedroom caught Dee and our housekeeper together, tangled in a betrayal I never thought I'd witness. They were on our bed, the sacred space where we had once shared love and promises. My hands trembled as I watched, tears streaming down my face. Every laugh and every touch between them were a dagger to my heart. The man I had stood by through illness, the man I had called my soulmate, had been lying to me most unimaginably. I felt numb. Part of me wanted to storm out of the house, confront them, and scream at the top of my lungs. But I knew I needed to be calm and think carefully about my next steps. I couldn't afford to let my emotions dictate my actions. That night, I didn't sleep. I replayed our years together, questioning every memory, every moment of joy, and wondering when the cracks had begun to form. I wondered if Dee had truly pretended to be a good man all along. Meanwhile, he was a wolf in sheep's clothing. I confronted Dee one more time, and I didn't give him any room to deny the affair. I ordered him out of the house without any care in the world where he was going to stay. I told him to take his lover and heartthrob along because they both belonged together. His face turned pale. For a moment he was silent, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for words. Finally he muttered, "It's not what you think." He tried to explain and justify his actions. He was full of half-hearted apologies and talked of feeling disconnected. But nothing he said could undo the damage he had done. Dee tried to fight back, claiming he didn't want to lose me or the life we had built together. He begged, pleaded, and promised to change, but it all felt hollow. Every word from his mouth reminded me of his lies, and I couldn't let myself fall into the trap of believing him again. His apologies, though frequent, lacked the weight of genuine remorse. I filed for a divorce, and trust me, it was a very messy one. I demanded that everything he had in his name be shared between us, even when I knew that he was just starting in life. I didn't care. I had given so much of myself, my love, time, and energy, only to be betrayed, so I refused to leave empty-handed. Our next story is how I took down my lying neighbor. If someone had told me that owning a house would cause so much chaos in my new neighborhood, I wouldn't believe them. To be more precise, owning a house in one's late 20s without having a husband came off as a problem to the older women in my neighborhood because somehow I was always the talk of the town. I knew my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Grace, had a lot to do with this, mostly because she didn't want to admit her son was an egomaniac with superiority complex, but I made sure to destroy her reputation like she had been trying to ruin mine. When I found out I was going to be transferred, I was so happy to finally get the chance I had been looking for, a chance to do more for myself. I never hated the hospital I worked at, but it was limiting my potential and wasn't as upgraded as the one in my new neighborhood. This was the chance I had been looking forward to, but then I had to also move from the place I've always known and called home. I would be leaving behind friends and family, and that was less exciting because I've always lived with my parents. Living with my parents made me have enough savings, enough to get a house in the new location I was moving to. Buying a house wasn't the first choice I had in mind. I was hoping to get an apartment, but then a friend of mine had a friend who was a realtor, and the house was going for a lower price than usual. He said the owners wanted to sell the place because they desperately needed the money and there were a lot of people interested in the house, but if I paid first, I could get the house. It was a fast process, and by the end of the week, I was the owner of the house. It was just the usual bungalow with a garage and small fence, but it was mine. I had little time to renovate and arrange my house to my taste because, firstly, I was broke, and secondly, I got to the house the week I was supposed to officially begin work, so I never got the chance to introduce myself properly to any neighbor. I had no idea who my neighbors were. I was just trying to get used to my new place of work, their rules, and how much time I spent there. And as a nurse who was mostly on night shift, I hardly went home till daybreak, when I assumed most people had gone to work. I had no idea most of the people who lived in my new neighborhood were retired, so when I saw some random woman seated on the couch next door, I decided to mind my business and go in, and this was because it was one of those exhausting days I'd overworked myself and was looking forward to my bed. I didn't notice anyone coming up to me. I just opened my door, went inside and shut the door and went to sleep. But by the end of the week, I noticed a couple of old women who passed by giving me cold stares as I was coming back from my morning jog. First, I thought it was the outfit, but later in the afternoon, someone knocked on my door and I saw a strange woman by the door who gave me a cold stare and bluntly told me to be nicer to my neighbor, who only intended to welcome me, but I shut the door on her face. She said her feelings were hurt about the whole incident. This came as a surprise to me because I had no idea I had done something wrong in the first place. I told the woman who came by that I had no idea my neighbor had stood up from her front couch and was coming to say hi, otherwise I would have waited. I decided to bake some cookies and properly greet my neighbor since it was my day off and apologized to her for being so nonchalant. I went over to my neighbor's place later that night. She was so friendly. We talked about a lot of things. She opened up a bottle of wine and we both had a little with the cookies I brought. It was a very nice night. I enjoyed every bit of our conversation, and on my way out, her son came in and she introduced us to each other. I found it odd that he was living with his mother because he looked like in his 30s, but said nothing since it wasn't my place to say anything, and it was none of my business. I thought I had made a friend, but I had no idea Mrs. Grace was a blabbermouth, because the next thing I know, I'm the new talk of the town. Somehow, Mrs. Grace told her friends about what we had talked about and added things I didn't say. And because I had no idea the street I was on was filled with elderly women who had single sons, I became the new spinster in town everyone wanted to set up with their sons, and each time I politely rejected this idea, I automatically became the enemy. Somehow, Mrs. Grace managed to corner me into having dinner with her and her son during Halloween after several times telling her I wasn't interested. We got talking and he seemed nice in front of his mother, but as soon as we were alone, he had this air of superiority, and at first I thought I was just trying to push myself into not liking him, so I decided to go on a date with him. This time, it was only the two of us, and he was a pompous, arrogant jerk with a touch of narcissistic attitude, so I decided then and there that it was a no-go area for me. For some reason, Mrs. Grace began spreading rumors about me being too cheap and sleeping with her son on the first date. I had no idea why she decided to go that far or if that was the story her son told her, and frankly, I couldn't care less. But her going ahead to tell people I did something I didn't was out of line, and I was determined to put her in her place. I decided to meet with the person in charge of these meetings they were constantly having, so I could be given the chance to put any crazy rumor to rest once and for all. But these women had some sort of unnecessary code and rules in place against a young person joining their committee, and they all shuffled the meeting amongst themselves each week, so there was no one in charge. I also went ahead to confront Mrs. Grace in front of her friends just to get her to admit that she was lying, but she didn't. Instead, she made up some crazy story about how I was being a little too clingy and should stop harassing her and her son. And I hated how everyone kept looking at me like I was some crazy lady with abandonment issues. Needless to say, going to the meeting was a dead end. I was able to achieve nothing. At first, I kept thinking they were just bored old ladies looking for the next big thing going on in the neighborhood, and soon it would die down, till I saw one of the women in the group meeting at the hospital I work at rejecting me in front of the staffs, saying she didn't trust my expertise. My boss tried to assure her she was in good hands, but then the woman started rambling on about how she knew me and I wasn't to be trusted. It was at that moment I realized just how bad it could get if I didn't put an end to this disastrous rumor Mrs. Grace started. But to officially get back at her and her son, I needed proof that he was just a crazy guy with ego issues who thinks the world revolves around him, and I knew one thing for sure was that he must have done it to other women, and the best way to find out these things was to check out all of his social media pages on the internet. Surely he had an ex he treated terribly and would love to get back at him. I found one particular lady he was with in most pictures and decided to find out more about her, and I did somehow get her contact information and asked her to meet. She seemed skeptical about the whole meeting thing at first, but agreed as soon as I told her I wanted to talk about Mrs. Grace's weird son. She came over and I asked her a couple questions. It turned out Mrs. Grace's son once dated this particular lady, but she left 6 months into the relationship because she couldn't cope with his disgusting attitude. I asked her if she would like to speak to the women in the meetings to clear my name from the accusations I was facing by them, and then she laughed and said most of them know the type of person Mrs. Grace's son was. They just didn't want to offend their sponsor by saying anything out of line. It was surprising to hear someone admit this. What those women were doing was wrong. She said they did the same thing to her when she came forward and told Mrs. Grace about her son's nasty behavior. She was scrutinized and blamed. She had to leave the neighborhood in the end to avoid further humiliation, and she was the one who used to live in the house I now currently own. She had to sell off the house and leave that neighborhood and advised I did the same, but I wasn't going to back down. Since this was something that had been going on in the neighborhood, Mrs. Grace and her accomplice were framing ladies who came into the neighborhood because they didn't want to have anything to do with her son. So I decided to go on investigation mode, and first I checked out each member of the meeting house for their family's photo by going over to their place, and about 8 of them each had daughters who looked like the same age as me, while the rest had sons or had no children. My goal was to get those who had daughters into one place and see the type of person Mrs. Grace's son was. Women hated men with such attitude and would not stand for it, so I knew they could convince their mum to stop backing Mrs. Grace. The only problem was that most of them weren't settled here, but in another city. But one thing I knew would always bring family together was Christmas. So I waited till December, and most of them came as predicted. I became friends with them since I was the only young lady living in the street anyways, and there was practically no one else to talk to. I decided to invite them over for a game night, and also invited Mrs. Grace's son, who took my invitation as a display of affection for him. I didn't even bother to argue with him. He came over and did not fail to show off his horrible character. I'm sure some sick part of him thought he was impressing the ladies, but he spoke so rudely, most of them left my apartment angrily, and then the next day, I went to each of the ladies' homes to apologize and to ask them to testify for me on Mrs. Grace's son's attitude, and they all did. I called for a meeting with the women whose daughter in fact told them the type of person he was and how they needed to stop indulging his mum but asking her to train her son properly. I knew the only way to get through to these women was through their daughters, and they all complied. They had a meeting with Mrs. Grace and told her her son was getting out of control, but Mrs. Grace just saw this as an attack and said I would pay dearly for defaming her son's name, which was just ridiculous. I decided I was with this woman and sued her for making false allegations against me. I didn't even know something like this could be done till I spoke to a friend who assured me I could in fact sue her, and if I had evidence, it would be taken seriously. My evidence was the women she kept feeding lies to her group members. They all cooperated with the lawyer who asked them about Mrs. Grace's son, and when Mrs. Grace saw just how bad things could get, she pleaded me to drop the lawsuit on the ground that she left with her son, and the next week had sold her house and was out of the neighborhood for good. That was the last I saw or heard from her, and I was glad to have been able to put her in her place as she rightly deserved. With that being said, that's all the time we have for today. If you enjoyed today's video, drop a like and comment below, and if you want to check out our other videos, click the video on the right. With that being said, I'll see you all next time.